Now, when we turn to ethical issues, what we found in the idealist tradition is a strong tendency toward valuing only mind or valuing only spirit, and so the only things that are true values are mind values or spiritual values, and there's a corresponding disparagement or outright denial of any value to things physical, including sexuality, food, money, sensual pleasures, right, and so forth. What you find then by contrast in realism is, since there's a much more integrated view of the human being here, an integration of the senses with the person's reason on the cognitive side, that what you find is that there is a great value between mind, or a great value to be found in, of course, mental values, but also great value to be found in bodily values. So mind and bodily values both. And in many cases what we'll find is that there's an integration of the experience that is not that you either do a bodily thing or you do a mental thing, although there are things that fall into those categories, that most of the important values of life are things that are both mental and physical, and the value is a joined value there as well. Another ethical thing that comes, or an ethical thesis that's important rather in idealism, is one's motivation. What we find there is there's a great emphasis on duty, a great emphasis on obligation, that a moral person is motivated by a sense that there are things that he or she is supposed to do, perhaps God has ordered it or some authority has ordered, and it's not so much a matter of what you want to do or what you're inclined to do, but rather what are my obligations, and I set aside my personal preferences and do what is my duty. In the case of realism, by contrast, there's much more of an emphasis on the pursuit of happiness, right, and the experience of happiness, or the living of a flourishing life as the human birthright, and that one should do things and one's life should be structured such that living the good life does lead to happiness. For the idealist, by contrast, whether one is happy or not really is beside the point, ethically speaking. Instead, one does what one is obligated to do, one obeys perhaps the higher authority, and in contrast, what we find in the realist tradition is much more of an emphasis on liberty, persons making their own choices, being self-motivated, as opposed to doing what is expected of them by those who are in charge. Okay. Now, I want to now turn to the issue of the place of religion in these two traditions. As I mentioned earlier, some idealists are religious, so if we think of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so forth, those are all religious variations of idealism, but idealism also doesn't have to be religious in that form. Plato, Kant, and various other major intellectuals in the Western tradition are idealistic as well, and so they will share many of these themes in abstraction, but differ over the details. We find the same thing in the realist tradition. There are, of course, many realists who are atheist in their orientation. They will see the natural world as a self-contained system. We don't need to understand it in terms of the supernatural agency or supernatural intervention. We can understand the world as a self-contained, self-governing system in its own terms. But there also have been many realists in the history of philosophy who have been religious. But what one finds is a very different kind of religion that comes out of the realist tradition than comes out of the idealist tradition. For example, most of the idealists who are religious, because of all of these themes put together, will argue that if one is going properly to revere the higher realm, to revere God, to come to know God, to properly worship God, that involves a very strong turning away from the physical world toward the natural world. That everything that God represents, the natural world is the exact opposite of. If God is purely good, the natural world is purely wicked. If God is eternal, the natural world is corrupt and subject to change. And so one's orientation then has to be metaphysically away from the natural world and to focus on the higher world. It involves, in terms of one's human nature, a turning away from the physical side of one's nature and a total focus on the spiritual side of one's nature. And that has important ethical implications. It means that one is not supposed to be interested in things of the body, food, drink, sex, money, and so forth. Instead, one is anti-materialistic and interested in spiritual things for their own sake. The kind of religion that one gets for realism is going to be a religion that is much more compatibilist in terms of the relationship between the natural world and the supernatural world. For example, the argument will be that if God exists and God made the natural world, then rather than the natural world being this horrible opposite to God kind of creation, if God made the natural world and God is good, then in principle the natural world has to be essentially good. And so it's then appropriately interested to be interested rather in the natural world, to want to study it, to want to learn it, to want to enjoy it. After all, God made it, and so He must have wanted us to do so. Also, what we will find typically in religious realism is that God made nature, and when we look at nature, we find that nature really is the way the scientists describe it as. He made a very cause and effect nature. He made a very orderly kind of nature. By contrast, what we'll find coming out of the religious idealist traditions is the idea of a God who made nature, but didn't simply make nature according to strict laws of cause and effect, right, and so forth, and let it go of its own devices. Instead, God is continuing to intervene. There are miracles. God is paying attention. At some point, God is angry at the way things are going in the natural world, and He might, at various points, be so disgusted that He says, "All right, I'm just going to wipe everything out and start all over." We think here of Noah and the flood, right, as an example. What we're more likely to find in the religious realist tradition is a more hands-off kind of God. So, for example, you have perhaps heard the line, people will say, I think the Big Bang theory is probably true, or at least it's the best thing going. We can understand all of human history as an evolution that goes back to the Big Bang, but there's still, of course, an open question about what was going on before the Big Bang occurred, and a religious realist will say something like, well, there had to have been some sort of a being who brought the materials of the Big Bang into existence and created those initial conditions, and then lit the fuse, so to speak, and then the Big Bang went off, and that's what God is. But what we have here is a God who is not whimsical, who is not driven by passions and anger and emotions, right, and so forth. Instead, we have a much more architect, mathematics, physicist kind of God, the kind of God who created the natural world and did his job so well that once He set the world off on its course, He no longer needs to intervene and be hands-on and start over, so to speak, as we find more likely to be the case in idealist religious approaches here.